right, welcome back to our third panel on this very interesting topic on if ZK can potentially in the future become even bigger than what we see with blockchain today. We have four panelists joining us who will help us answer this question. We have Clement from Kakarot, Avi from Nil Foundation, Teemu from Gevulot, and Austin from O1 Labs. In terms of the main motivation behind this panel topic, like this for some brief history, the concept of a ZK proof was developed back in the 80s, but it remained largely conceptual until it was being applied in the Web3 space, like in both the scaling and the privacy aspects. Over the years, we also witnessed proof sizes and costs decrease, and that was also a significant contributing factor to its accessibility. But now we've reached a point where we're also considering applying ZK beyond Web3 applications, and therefore the idea that ZK may one day potentially reach a larger scale than blockchain. Each of our panelists here who are joining us today have been heavily involved in both the ZK and general blockchain spaces. I'm very excited to hear about all of your perspectives. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us, Alice. Hey, everyone.
Yeah, hello everyone from me as well. It's going to be exciting talk.
Yes, super excited. Okay, so for our first question, I first wanted to discuss about ZK's role in blockchain space. So in the blockchain context, we see ZK as very multifaceted and offering a lot of very strong value propositions in its privacy, scalability, and interoperability. How do you view ZK's role in the future of blockchain? Or if there's like any sort of predictions that you foresee?
Who's going to take it?
You win for it, Teemu. Go for it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think how ZK is used in blockchain is fairly well established already. Like the reason it started out being used in blockchain is mainly just because re-execution is so inefficient. Even if ZK compute has some amount of overhead, I think some of the recent estimates are somewhere like 10,000x overhead. That might still be justified in a situation where you otherwise would have thousands of servers doing the same thing. And so it makes sense in that context. I think it'll continue to be used, and really the question of like how it's going to be used in blockchain is largely the same question as like whether it will go beyond blockchain, which is that it depends on how low the overhead becomes over time. And of course, we're betting quite heavily that the overhead will get much, much lower. But I think the use cases for now are pretty well established. You obviously have the privacy side of things, and then the scaling side of things, and those two kind of overlap in a lot of areas.
Yeah, I'll not going to disagree with Teemu. I feel like we're probably not going to disagree a lot on this panel, but I'll just double down on the view that really ZK's value proposition is best seen and best utilized within the context of blockchains, right? These systems that are built for adversarial environments where things like computational integrity, privacy are pretty much key to building systems at global scale. And I think uncontroversially, the best use for ZK today, at least as far as I see it, and I'm definitely biased, but it is scaling blockchains. And specifically, ZK is the unlock for horizontal scalability. It allows you to build a system that effectively has the scale of app chains with the composability of a monolithic blockchain, right? And you're able to run many machines in parallel over local state routes and have instant settlement between those. And I think this is where the entire industry is heading, and we see many different teams working in this direction. It's also where we're placing our bets at Nil Foundation.
Yeah, and without sounding like a complete echo chamber, I tend to agree. Like, it's like compute is the obvious now use case, and I don't need to speak too deeply on that. We've got Teemu here from Gevulot that can talk about that. But privacy is the obvious use case, and the thing that I think the ecosystem struggles with there is where are the paying users for privacy applications, and it's not super clear exactly which ones will get pulled out of the market. I think like switching from like the now to the future, there's like areas of verifiable compute, the Internet of True Things, like larger, I would say more esoteric ideas that it's going to be some step functions in order to get there. And it's not super clear exactly what happens in between now and then. So I think of ZK as a little bit more fundamental, like lower on the stack than blockchain generally. So by definition, it has the power to power more things, but exactly what those things are, it's still TBD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I will chime in. Sorry,
go ahead.
because I realize we're all kind of like saying the same thing. I will chime in. Like one area that I am excited for experimentation is bringing off-chain data on-chain. So the ZK TLS work, like essentially gluing in Web2 services into a Web3 context. I think this is like a really exciting emerging use case of ZK. But at the end of the day, kind of to Austin's point, like ZK in that context is really sitting at a much lower level within the stack, and it is essentially doing the same thing, right? It is offering some sort of like integrity guarantees about a computation that is being run elsewhere, which is exactly how it's being used in the context of scaling blockchains. These horizontal scalability solutions where you have a chain or a local state root being updated by a machine, and then sharing the outputs along with a proof with these other participants in the system. So kind of just a different shape or different form for an existing application of ZK.
Yeah, definitely. And I really appreciate Avi for you mentioning, especially like as, for example, with the use case of ZK-TLS, now we're not just exclusively confined to just the Web3 context, but we can instead incorporate Web2 services as well, which will definitely help with that accessibility component. And like your point on ZK as the unlock for our horizontal scalability as well. And Austin, also really appreciate you for mentioning that like you see ZK as having like a lower place on the stack, and that like potentially in the future we will see it like emerge as more popularized than like in our Web3 context. It's just we're just building our way towards there. And we also have Clement, who recently joined us. Clement, the question that we were addressing was like in the blockchain context, we see ZK being applied in like a lot of areas, and they have their own benefits in like privacy and scaling and interoperability. I'm wondering if you could also touch on like ZK's role in the future of blockchain.
So yes, I think that you have said a lot about blockchain application, of course. I do, as a personal opinion, of course, I do see a lot of use case for auditability, I would say, generally speaking. Lots of people, of course, are talking about ZK ML. It makes sense because you want to make sure at some point that the algorithm runs well. But it's not only about ML. I can imagine a world where, for accountability, for example, where you need to produce the end of your statement, or even when your bank produces your bank statement for yourself, that people will share numbers and the proofs that people just can make sure that there is no mistake anywhere else. So I think accountability is a big space for ZK, to be honest, in terms of compression and making sure that there is no, even if people are honest at the end, there is no hole in the whole process of the produced results. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to scope out a bit beyond like the Web3 context, beyond blockchains. I'm wondering if we can now touch on what makes ZK uniquely positioned to impact industries that are like beyond what we see in blockchain, and what specific industries you see will stand to benefit from ZK?
This is a pretty hard question. So I like to use an analogy here in terms of ZK adoption, which is that like right now, probably if all elections were completely digital, it would already make sense to use ZK to verify the like calculation or tally of the vote. And the reason is that you have this situation where you only need to do this thing once that otherwise would get done many times. And there's a very high sort of payoff for expending that compute or extra compute in order to verify the result. Where we like how far we go from there really again depends on like how efficient we make everything. And I think it's a pretty sort of straightforward, I don't know what it is, curve, like progression, something. I think like our bet is basically that like we will move along this trajectory over time, and more things like there will be more and more use cases which it makes sense to prove, and that's why Gevulot is building ZK Cloud, where the idea is like the very far away vision is like maybe you just have something kind of like AWS, but you don't actually need to trust any of the hardware operators, and the like usage is very similar to how you would use AWS. So there's like one way of thinking about ZK, if it fulfills its promise, is it really kind of merging Web 2 and Web 3, where like Web 3 ends up having so much capacity and is so efficient, then it's basically Web 2, and then we can build kind of everything on top of it. But where we actually end up remains to be seen. So I would really look in the short term towards use cases where you either have some very efficient client-side proofs, so like an end user can compute something, like there's a lot of experiments around this, around identity. ZK-TLS is kind of an example as well. Things like that, where you want to get verification from some individual actor that they've done something, and there's like that's a part of how it works, like it's individual information, you may not want to divulge it all, or it's like a lot of information that one individual has and you don't want to share that data, like all of that data across. But then like beyond that, like you start to have these, I think what I would look towards is kind of like the same type of stuff we were looking at in the early days of blockchain, of like, okay, who's going to use Bitcoin or whatever? I think the answer, like the real answer of who needs Bitcoin, is actually governments need Bitcoin, because governments don't trust each other. And there's no neutral party between governments. And the same kind of applies here. So a lot of these kind of coordination or trust problems can potentially be solved. And so like the end all, like a lot of the first use cases I think will come from ZK providing a novel approach to, for example, like election fraud or something like that. In the blockchain space, of course, it's mainly just more capacity. So as I was alluding to earlier, like, can we make blockchains basically like as efficient as computers in the regular world? And then this ties into the audience question a little bit as well. Like, I think the path is very similar between blockchains and ZK. Like, it's kind of all heading towards the same thing. Yeah, Avi.
Yeah, well, I generally agree. I think, I probably have a bit more maybe of like a blockchain maximalist view than like a ZK maximalist view, and the reason is that, we and myself included, hold this view that blockchains will be the settlement layer for everything of value in the modern world. And when you think about like ZK and where is it useful, it's useful in these contexts where you're facilitating some transfer of value, and there's a degree of trust that can almost be explicitly expressed as some dollar amount. And And I think, things like assets, things like identity, even, right, which kind of comes back to this example that Teemu talked about with voting. We believe these things will live on chain, inevitably. And in order for you to, sort of reckon with the overhead that ZK brings and blockchains bring, there needs to be this sort of attachment to value. So I really think of like blockchains and ZK in terms of where do they live within the world and how do they progress as one in the same. And I'm not, I struggle to see where ZK really thrives without the presence of value and settlement. Yeah.
Can I quickly just touch on that? Because I kind of agree. I think ZK beyond blockchain has this issue where it's very unclear what the commercial opportunity is. And so it's like very easy to argue that ZK, if you could scale blockchains, is like a large commercial opportunity, but then identity, stuff like that, these are kind of like economic coordination problems that still haven't really been solved by any other manner besides like a central government.
Yeah, I want to concretely talk about value. And if we're looking at that question from the audience of early days of blockchain, like blockchain sort of exploded when the value opportunities were evident. And those have largely been like the DeFi opportunities. And that was kind of like the large value moment for blockchain in general. And there was a massive explosion that happened afterwards. So I see like challenges towards adoptions being sort of the inertia behind like large projects with massive network effects. Like there's not really going to be a ton of value in just building like ZK Instagram or like ZK Telegram or ZK Salesforce or ZK something. Like the value is not just because it's ZK and then insert whatever, the same way that we've noticed that the most valuable like distributed apps or decentralized apps have not just been decentralized to exactly one thing. It's been using a novel or it's been using a primitive that has been unlocked by blockchain. I think the same thing will happen with ZK. If I was a betting man, I would say that like currently what we're observing right now is that most of the value is being, I would say, realized in the sort of computation and scaling space, and I think that that'll probably continue in the short term. But I think that like the sort of natively derived ZK value is still yet to be determined.
I'm surprised a bit because, I mean, at least from Europe perspective, with even for the AI Act, where people will need to make sure that the inference of their model has been made by the given model accepted, stamped to be valid, to be honest, then you will need to give proof that you have actually used this code and not even the code, but the model. So the fact, I mean, the ability to be able to verify that a given output has been produced by a given code without redoing everything is definitely the thing that makes sense, at least for this market, which is expected to be like at least very big from the European perspective. So I think that outside of blockchain, there are already some ideas close to production for usage of ZK, especially this one I've just mentioned.
Can I just jump in and Clement, ask you a question here? Because like in what context does the does like inference need to be proven?
Yes,
right?
So sorry. No, please. I thought the question was terminated, but anyway.
No, I mean, I was just going to add on, like, in my view, inference is important to be like verifiable in the context in which that output is then fed into an action that is touching value, or that output is actually like triggering something on chain or some sort of payment. I do not need, for example, or at least I'm not willing to pay, and I struggle to see other people willing to pay for verifiability over inference for just say, hey, write me a poem.
Yes, but the problem is with the regulation. I mean, if the AI Act in the European Union is established and passes. This, I mean, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I had the presentation a few 2 months ago. So anyway, overall, the idea is that if even a company wants to use internally AI to support business teams, to prompt whatever they want and to generate the contents, even internally, the company needs to make sure that the tool they give to their users or to their internal users is compliant. And the compliance is made on a per model basis. And even if you fine tune, you don't have the same model from the regulatory perspective. So you need to make sure, even for a company, that the people actually don't mess up with the values of the models, and they actually use this exact same set of data that has been one day validated. So in this context, you may find it worse, and maybe it will limit the use case of AI because it costs more. But in the context where you think it can bring value to the company, then you will probably want to make sure that they use the one that is accepted.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we definitely see the value of ZK and computation scaling. It's what Austin, Avi, and Clement mentioned. But there still, of course, needs to be some work on where that greater commercial opportunity lies, like what you mentioned, Teemu. And like the value proposition doesn't just come from like attaching ZK in front of our existing applications, like just echoing what you said, Austin. And I do want to address a question that we had from the audience, which is, are there any parallels between the early adoption of blockchain and what we're seeing now with ZK? And how can we apply the lessons that we learned from blockchain adoption to inform the successful scaling of ZK?
I'll kick us off. Like, I think the S curve is kind of obvious, where it's just like ZK is lagging behind on that S curve. But like anecdotally, like I was at ZK Summit last week, and the I would say like the entire room is like researchers and applied cryptographers essentially. Like I'm probably one of the few people that hasn't written a line of code in the last couple of months. And I think that is like a step function shift from what you'd expect at a Web3 conference, like as of now. But if you go back in time, I'd imagine that nearly every sort of blockchain conference, whether it was like the Bitcoin or the Ethereums, it started with researchers and it started with applied engineers. Like I would argue, like, and I have argued that like the critical turning point was where like value accrual was, and that's where people that don't just write code, sort of their light bulb goes off and they see, there's actually opportunity here. There's users that have real need, and then that's where the sort of the pie gets bigger and more people can show up. I think that when, as we were moving like through like these challenges, there's probably a few blockers that I think are like needed to be pushed through, and some of them actually are like still in like the research and like I would say like research bridging to applied engineering, which is just like the ability to handle complex computation. Like significant progress has been made, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. Like not just large proof, but handling like arbitrarily large programs of large size with like significant memory constraints. That will just enable developers to build large scale applications that actually hit use cases as opposed to things that are closer on the toy side of the spectrum.
Yeah, maybe just to touch on that as well a little bit. So I've been around the blockchain space since 2012, and I remember a lot of the early conferences. I think Austin, you're right that there's like you had like it was a very different profile of person, right? Bitcoin didn't attract like cryptographers, but there were certainly nerds of one kind or another. And I think that same thing is happening here. I think like the most important thing to happen to blockchain in some ways, or crypto, however you want to think about it, is that the nerdy aspects kind of got abstracted away. I think like, I mean, we're not even halfway there probably in many ways, but there are a lot of people who are involved in the industry who have no idea about like how P2P, networking works or anything like that. And so I think that stuff is important. And so, and I notice, and there's always a tendency in the initial group to focus very much on all the like cool technical details and get very like excited about stuff that like ultimately most people don't give a crap about. And so I think something that ZK, like as a sector of the blockchain industry, lacks right now, and which sort of happened with Bitcoin as well, is we kind of lack kind of a narrative that makes sense to like a normal person. And with Bitcoin, it was like, are we cash? Ultimately, it kind of came to store of value, partially because nobody could figure out at that time really how to do anything else. But that, I think, is something we should try to learn and start to sort of intentionally change over time, where we start moving away from just talking about like how this is going to scale this and that compute. Like, I think even the concept of compute is a little bit like esoteric for a lot of people, and start moving towards like, what does this do, or what can this do for some average person now? And that will take time. That's the other lesson from early blockchain stuff, is it takes quite a bit longer than people think.
Yeah, I think like another way to kind of say what both Austin and Teemu shared is that you just can't slap ZK in front of an application and therefore it has some value, which you saw a lot during the 2017 ICO craze. Uber on the blockchain, and the same thing is probably going to happen with ZK, and I think in some places has. But I think, hopefully we can learn some lessons from blockchain adoption and recognize that, when a technology is tied to a financial asset that allows people to speculate on the upside, that we can kind of like get in front of our skis at times, and just staying really kind of disciplined and ruthless about, does this have value? Is this bringing value to end users? I think it's probably the most important lesson to apply from blockchain into ZK.
Yes. And myself, I've not been in blockchain for such a long time, maybe 3 years and more. I mean, approximately 3 years. And I come from usual Web 2 engineering things. And I really see blockchain as another kind of cloud provider. Like, to me, I'm talking about Ethereum as I'm talking about AWS or GCP. In my mind, it's just another kind of product that is offered by a different company. It's not actually a company, but anyway. And as a developer, for a part of your application, it may make sense to use this backend and not to use an AWS Lambda function, because you will benefit from composability with other application, because you will benefit from a native payment layer, for example. And so that's what I'm working about. We at Kakarot, for example, work to make this alternative cloud provider as efficient as possible, so that the most of the application can consider using this type of cloud provider for the type of application that makes sense, like moving a part of their application on chain, because it will be easier for payment or for interacting with others. And if it's too expensive, then of course the number of applications considering this is very low, very small. And if it's not expensive, if it scales, as we say, then lots of applications will be able to introduce a bit, and it's probably much easier for all the end users that don't care at all about the information of Facebook, or no, it's not Facebook anyway, but anyway, where their favorite website is hosted. You can ask someone, is your website, where do you scroll every day? Or I use TikTok. Is TikTok deployed on GCP? They don't know. They don't care at all. So I think that this needs to be moved away from the end user point of view, and just the developers will benefit from new features as we scale. And that's actually the goal, I think, from a regular dev point of view, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I would really like to emphasize Teemu's point on the key area that ZK is lacking in is that narrative that makes sense to like an average layperson, to a normal person outside of the space. And then even Teemu, you mentioned that even the concept of compute can seem foreign to many people. But just going off the topic of challenges, I'm wondering if you guys can speak about some of the other like biggest challenges you see and that you're working on facing ZK from both the technical and also the adoption standpoint. I know, Austin, you mentioned briefly about like handling those more complex computation, reducing overhead, and then like in addition to large proofs as well. I'm wondering, how can ZK drive mainstream awareness and mainstream adoption, especially if it doesn't have like as clear of a consumer facing component as we've seen in blockchain so far?
That's a really hard question to answer, honestly. So I agree. I think that we do need to have sort of a mainstream narrative that more than the applied researchers or the applied cryptographers, applied engineers can actually use. Unfortunately, I think that currently the people that are willing to build and willing to pay are actually closer to the infrastructure side than the end user side. So I do actually see a period where we're probably still going to be building infrastructure for a period of time. And I think that, like, why in ZK? Like, why do we need more infrastructure in ZK? Looking at some of the analogs like AWS or Ethereum, right? Like AWS and those other like cloud providers, they do a great job of sort of distributing compute across a bunch of things. And then Ethereum, they do an amazing job of having decentralized compute like across like a bunch of different nodes. But like really, those are kind of two obvious like trade-offs that both of those projects are making. And like I look at ZK and like particularly with ZK, what we've done with Mina, building Mina, is to try and like bridge both of those gaps, right? So you get decentralized and distributed compute, right? Like you get interoperability, you get censorship resistance, you get scalability, and all of those amazing things that ZK offers while being applied to that sort of like compute landscape. And unfortunately, that's not really a very friendly consumer focused like narrative, but I do think that like builds infrastructure that should enable that. So really, this is a call to action to like founders and projects that are starting to see use cases pop up that take advantage of those properties. But I do think that we're probably staring down a few more months, quarters, maybe years of infrastructure being like the primary focus in the ZK space. I'm curious what the rest of the group thinks.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think like to go very, very practical, I think rollups. So like look at the market right now. Like rollups as a concept have product market fit. We have many examples of very popular rollups. People are getting accustomed to the idea that there's a lot of these different ecosystems. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to figure out in terms of interoperability. Everyone is now trying to do their own interoperability thing, and we know how these things go when you have many standards, and then somebody tries to do a standard to unify all the standards, and now you have even more standards. But I think the most immediate thing for ZK is becoming competitive with optimistic rollups on cost. That I think is, like, broadly speaking, the thing. On almost any other kind of metric you can track it on, it is better. But on cost, it's not quite there. And optimistic has had time to accumulate users and so on. So ZK really needs to get into, or ZK rollups need to get into a position where they can actually start to acquire users and build out their own ecosystems. And so a lot of the work right now across the whole kind of sector is around, like, how do we make ZK rollups more competitive? And I think, like, it's very clear they're going to be. In fact, I think it's very clear it's not going to take too long before they're better on every possible metric than optimistic rollups. But that's where a lot of the focus has been, because it requires potentially, like, Ethereum protocol level changes or like additions, which the optimistic teams have managed to kind of push through before ZK rollups went live. We need to think about verification costs, about DA, about proving costs, etc. Because those all sort of end up getting bundled into the actual end user transaction fees. So yeah, I think that's really, like, the biggest challenge. And once that gets solved, sort of in some way, basically, like, once we start building actual ecosystems, I think the conversation changes a lot to, like, okay, how far can we take it, and can we facilitate use cases which really haven't been possible on blockchains before. But it's all on a continuum of blockchains improving, right? Like you're always trying to increase performance or lower costs to make new use cases possible. And I think really the promise of ZK is a combination of very low costs and almost infinite capacity. So like you might be able to build applications which are just an order of magnitude more complex than a Uniswap. Like I think if you actually look at what like many of the Ethereum smart contract systems are, like they're not that complicated systems because they kind of can't be. It would be too expensive. And historically, if we look at even just the internet, as we increase bandwidth, as we get more performance, as we get more compute, whatever, people very quickly come up with ways of utilizing that for new things. Like we've never been in a period of like abundant bandwidth and compute. Like we've always utilized all of it. And so I'm very excited to see how that shapes out. But like first we need to hit on the kind of immediate value proposition to kind of get the flywheel going.
Excuse me. Yes, I think as well that there is a scaling. I mean, we still miss, to me, like 100x somehow in terms of scaling, in terms of TPS, so that we can onboard regular application. And what I have in mind when I say regular application is that, for example, you take Lime bikes, if you have them in your city, or like bike sharing application, nothing related to blockchain. It makes somehow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 TPS. This is the bandwidth that they require for the network. There is a payment system going with it. And so for this kind of application to move on chain, it may make sense because also they don't need to change their server all the time. There is no privacy for their data. For example, they don't care. Everything is already public. Then they need to make sure that they can sustainably use 5 TPS, that the price of using this, if they subsidize for the user, is not going to bump because something else will happen on chain. And that's it. So for this, if like one bike sharing application needs 5 TPS and you want to start actually doing BD to this kind of application, you need to have not only 250 because it's too short in terms of security margin, but maybe 20 or 50k TPS. Then people can really start thinking about moving on chain because it makes sense. So this is typically the kind of example that we are working on at Kakarot. This kind of business that completely outside of blockchain would not mind moving on chain because there is a, for example, typology of business, no required privacy, mix of small data usage and payment, and also no willing to update the stack every day because, I mean, they are not software engineers. So they want to make sure that if they have tested something and deployed something, it will not move. It will be the exact same version running and it can run the same for 5 years. And they are fine like that. And for example, they may also want to have high availability. And if you want to have high availability on AWS, for example, you need to pay an extra. And it can cost a lot. Even if you don't make a lot of changes to your database, just because AWS bills you to make sure that you have the high availability, like 24/7 availability, no downtime, and so on and so forth. So the blockchain has features that with, to my mind, 20K to 50, from 20K TPS or maybe a bit more, 50K TPS, regular business will start to look at and be happy to jump in. That's really my opinion.
All right, I'll close this out, and I'm not going to disagree with anybody here. I think I want to reiterate what Teemu. Oh, you don't hear me, Clemente?
I hear him.
You hear me? Okay, I'm going to keep going. I mean the critical path for blockchains includes ZK, and that's why the experts of the industry who are like closest to core infrastructure, who have been in the space for the longest time, are putting their effort and time into building out ZK technology. And I want to reiterate a point that I shared earlier, which is ZK allows for these decentralized systems like blockchains to scale out horizontally, adding new machines to the network, and increasing the capacity of compute that is available for applications. And if you hold a worldview that blockchains will underpin meaningful amounts of economic activity and are the substrate for money and finance and markets and other things like voting and identity, these need to be some of the most scalable systems in the world. And when I say that, it's not a function of 10,000 TPS or 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000. We need to be doing millions and millions of transactions per second, requests per second, in order for this to actually come to fruition. And ZK, as of right now, is the only technology that allows us to do this trustlessly and verifiability. Now, I want to add one more comment, which is kind of separate to that, which is I think this question was like something around how does like ZK enter like the consumer world, or how does it come to like, how do we make it more amenable or accessible to like end retail or consumers? And I think there's actually this is a really important time for ZK, and we hosted a community space with David Wong and Anna from ZK Podcast not too long ago, talking about the ZK community and the trajectory of its growth. And right now, to Teemu's point, I don't think there's a clear narrative around what ZK is for the non-technically inclined mind. There also isn't a clear set of values, and when you compare the adoption of blockchains, which from the get-go had a very almost religious slant to what do these people stand for beyond just their view on the technology, ZK, I think, is really lacking this. And if there isn't like a value set that emerges that the ZK community is all willing to kind of get behind and say, this is what we stand for, and really say it with their chest, I think ZK just will inevitably end up being a technology, and it will just be that. And I think that's actually a totally okay outcome. Like, we don't need like every technology to be a religious movement, but I do think like there's a very real possibility that ZK like never becomes a consumer thing or a thing that people really even think about beyond those who are in the weeds of infrastructure, unless of course they kind of find this like cultural movement.
Can I just quickly double down on the horizontal scalability thing, because I think it's a good thing to just spell out. So Ethereum,
Please.
you add compute to the network, you get no more compute out really of the network. You just get more of the same thing, right? Like, you can add as many servers as you want to Ethereum. You may be like, you're increasing kind of the security and the guarantees that what was done correctly. But it's not like if you use a hyperscaler, you add servers because you're using more compute. That's not what's happening. You're still only computing the same amount. While on, for example, Gevulot ZK Cloud, like, because you only need one server to do the thing with a proof, and then you can very efficiently verify it. You can like, every additional server gives the network more compute. And this kind of applies on a much larger level. The Ethereum scaling roadmap is, in fact, this idea is like, what if we can just have these like roll-ups and co-processors and other things, which are like adding servers to the network to scale out compute. And then that just gets verified on like the base chain. And so I think it's actually a really important point. And just to touch quickly on the value side, because I think it's related. I think Clement maybe said it, and Avi kind of in some ways. But I think really like what the ZK industry, in my opinion, should be shooting for is like 1,000x from where we are now. Like, if ZK ends up being like, okay, like Solana or ZK rollup, it doesn't really matter. That then there's not really much point. It needs to be like we can genuinely build like most of our digital infrastructure on chain because we have the capacity and it's cheap enough.
Yeah, and it's not just like the technicalities that go with ZK, or even just about like reducing proof sizes, costs, even though those are important. But outside of Web3 context, what's equally important, what I'm hearing from all of you, is determining that value proposition and that narrative that makes sense for people like who are outside of the space as well. And then to your point, Avi, it should also be scalable as well for this to really be consumer focused. So we do have an interesting question from the audience as well, which is how critical is the adoption of blockchain to the growth of ZK? Or can ZK's potential be fully realized independently of blockchain? So like the question is, does ZK always need to have a tie with blockchain, or can it be independent in the future?
I feel like we've kind of discussed this question, like, or we've like shared thoughts around this question. And so I'm just going to say something that I've already said, which is, I think it's certainly possible that ZK lives outside of the context of blockchains. However, I don't really see like viable, scalable use cases for ZK beyond blockchains. And again, it comes back to this, like understanding essentially like the cost structure of compute. When you're running, a program and generating a proof, there you have this overhead, and this overhead you need to have some like economic reasoning as to why that is worthwhile. And again, in the context of blockchains, this makes a lot of sense, right? But elsewhere, it's not as clear. I actually think the other area it makes sense is TradFi, which I just don't. I'm not. I don't want to build for that. I want to build for the new thing. For the more efficient thing, for the thing that's going to be the future. So, yeah, I hope it is actually blockchains. I hope that the adoption of ZK is sort of spearheaded and led in the context of blockchains.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, without having the blockchain kind of commercial use case driving the research, it would take like 100 years to make this, progress we can make in 10. And so I think they're kind of inevitably linked from that perspective. I also think just on the TradFi point, like I think ZK is also a part of like how we bridge the gap to TradFi, and so there's even like a strategic alliance in some ways, and we're treating these two as separate entities, and actually one is kind of like a kind of weird cult around a technology, and the other one is like a cryptographic primitive, so they're not really like comparable. But I'm a big fan of like basically I think blockchains and thus with ZK's help potentially have a better shot, but like I think blockchains are a vampire attack on TradFi, and that's basically like what we need to facilitate with ZK and with other things. Like ZK is just an enabler for the scale that TradFi needs, but there's obviously all kinds of other things that need to be done for that to work out.
Yeah, great. Clement or Austin, do you have any more thoughts to add?
I would say not especially lots. Thanks to blockchain, I mean, ZK has done incredible improvement in the past 10 years, I think somehow. And so blockchain has been really funding the research in ZK. And so hopefully blockchain will find a very good use case with ZK and will keep funding this research up until some other areas can benefit from ZK as well. That's how I see things.
Yeah, without sounding repetitive, I would tend to agree. I think that this group's hit on it, and I think distributed decentralized compute is probably the next sort of frontier, and that's likely powered by blockchain. And I think that ZK, like from a pure research perspective, Clement, I think you're right, where we've just observed that the applications in blockchain have basically funded 25 years of ZK research in 5 years. So similar to your idea, Teemu.
I once heard a ZK researcher say something like blockchain's product market fit is funding ZK research. Totally true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just as a last question before we close up today's panel, I'm wondering if you can all share about your predictions for both spaces in the next few years, and how you personally see like both the ZK space and the blockchain space evolving.
Sure, I'll get us started. Like I think, like I was mentioning, I think infrastructure is going to be the key piece over the next, like I would say, short term. And I think like verifiable compute, so formal verification, I think that's going to be an incredibly hot space over the next couple of years. I do think that like the sort of Internet of True Things narrative is going to continue to expand. Like I really admire projects like Reclaim and Pluto, and I think that those are going to expand beyond just like identity apps, which is what they are right now, into actually saying, okay, to a normal non-cryptographer, what does it actually mean to be like a part of the sort of internet, like this future internet, this truth internet? And I think there's going to be a lot of infrastructure as well as use cases that are going to power it. That's what I'm most excited for.
Go ahead.
I said first. I think I'm going to keep it short. I think a ZK-enabled blockchain surpasses Solana. And I think it does so probably sooner than folks believe. And it will largely be because of the horizontal scale, the capacity that blockchain is able to serve.
Well, I'll give a counterpoint to that. Maybe Solana becomes a ZK blockchain. Kind of can't beat them, join them thing. But I sort of on that angle. So I think sort of one thing that's happening in ZK is that implementation is lagging behind research quite a bit. And so what we see potentially all of us kind of in the background of like the progress that's being made in terms of performance gains and so on, that won't be implemented like immediately. We kind of have like the very first generation of roll-ups online and some blockchains like Alio and Mina and so on. We have like the first real attempts at programmable privacy, etc. And I think as the whole industry just gets or like starts increasing that feedback loop between like research progress and implementation, things will start to get quite wild. So I to kind of echo Avi, I think we'll see a number of very large ZK rollups. I think we'll start to see novel ways to do sort of roll-up abstraction, driven by the fact that as a proof for everything, and in like abstraction or interoperability, they're kind of murky and overlapping terms. But I'm not necessarily going to say it's going to be bigger than Solana, but there will be like breakout successes that, and some of them probably not things that we've like would point to right now. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very, very big year or very, very big year or two for ZK.
Yes, and I think as well that possibly with the development, I mean, as you were saying, Teemu, the lagging of the research, the lagging of the implementation behind the research also comes with not so good libraries, possibly. And so the improvement of the libraries make available the usage of ZK to everyone. And I think it's similar to what has been made, for example, in AI, when you remember like back in 2012, 2014, we had like TensorFlow 0 point something. It was quite hard to write the tensors, quite low level programming. And then at some point, for example, I think that Keras made a great job at making like everyone suddenly a deep learning engineer. Like everyone was able to build anyway, it was convenient back in the days, but anyway, everyone was like able to write a convolutional network for their own use cases. And maybe their network were not the best in class network. Maybe still some people were much better at building good algorithms. But in any case, at the end, people were able to use libraries at a good level of abstraction so that they would build products in lots of different areas thanks to these good libraries. So I expect to have a higher level library for example, for stacks for writing better errors, so that people can really think about what they want to prove. They can generate at a good level of abstraction what they need in terms of proving system, not writing the circuits, and then ZK will generalize the application in different areas, I think. And also you see like new generation of provers that are able to manipulate several errors at the same time, for example, like the Stu prover of Starkware. So yes, I think that people will generate more dedicated proving system with higher level tools.
Yeah, thanks, Clement, for adding about like the development of those new libraries, new levels of abstraction which will definitely contribute to greater developer adoption as well. So yeah, we're still in our very early stage with ZK, and blockchain Web3 space in general has really accelerated its development. But as you all have mentioned, there definitely needs to be some work regarding shaping and framing the narrative and really honing down on like the values that ZK provides, especially when we're trying to apply this to outside the Web3 context. But yeah, thank you so much today, everyone, for joining and for all your insights. Teemu, Avi, Austin, Clement, really happy to have had you here today.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Everyone.